Hello, welcome to the Servative Hour. It's an hour of political commentary on social and political controversies with a point of view in opposition to the movement that calls itself conservative. And since we don't have the new phones yet, unfortunately it is still waiting to return to being a call-in show. However, do have a topic for this January 4th, 2022, and it is the January 6th, 2021 anniversary. Have some articles and some comments. And the first I have is from wonkat.com, titled 2021, We Had a Coup. It's by Liz Dye. And it was published December 31st, 2021. It's been a year since Donald Trump and his allies tried to overthrow our government. We all know what happened. You were there. I was there. Well, you and I weren't there, of course, because we're not traitors to democracy. But that day is permanently burned into all our psyches, from the Trump family dancing in that tent to Gloria, to the inane speeches by the collection of grifters at the ellipse, to the sickening feeling we all felt watching the red-hatted mob breach the barricades. It's like September 11th. We'll all remember forever where we were when. Quote, landed safe, my son texted me from the airport at 3:39 that day on his way back to college. Quote, there's an attempted coup going on in D.C., I responded, remembering lying in bed, hugely pregnant with him when NPR said that a plane had hit the first tower. Quote, probably just a fluke accident, my husband assured me when I raced to tell him in 2001. It wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't a fluke in 2021 either. And like September 11th, January 6th was horrible, but what came after was worse, because for one tiny moment we thought perhaps the spell would be broken. Maybe Republicans would stop this madness, stop the lies that were ripping us apart, and had brought us to a place where the halls of Congress were taken over by men shouting to, quote, hang Mike Pence. There was a moment when it looked like Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy might finally seize the opportunity to get their house in order for the good of America. But then Republicans refused to back down, going forward with the plan to contest the swing state electors based on evidence which had been soundly and repeatedly debunked. Having brought the country to the brink of catastrophe, they couldn't let go of the big lie about a stolen election, and instead turned it into the central pillar of the Republican Party. Forget tax cuts, or defense, or even the culture war. This is what they stand for going forward, the belief that a minority party is entitled to hold power, and if the voters reject them, then the voters are illegitimate. And so they put all their chips on crazy and blew up the bipartisan effort to get to the bottom of what happened. Maybe it was Antifa, or BLM, or FBI agitators, they said. Or blank, why not aliens? But we know what happened because, again, we were there. Trump tried every way he could think of to hold on to power, despite losing the Electoral College by 104 votes, and the popular vote by 8 million. He sent his goons to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power, and because his own appointees were terrified that he'd try to deploy the army against Congress, there was no one there to stop the mob. It was only thanks to the heroics of the badly outmanned Capitol Police that a massacre was prevented. And yet each new day brings fresh, new details to shock us. Mark Meadows with his Italian space laser, the attempted coup at the Justice Department, Trump's call to the Georgia Secretary of State threatening criminal consequences if the state didn't, quote, find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have because we won the state, end quote. The defenestration of Liz Cheney from the Republican Party for the crime of telling the damn truth. The apparent connivance of members of the GOP with the most harebrained, unconstitutional schemes to throw out the votes of 18 million Americans. And on and on. We are all the way through the looking glass now. Republicans are barely even pretending to follow the law as they give two big middle fingers to the House January 6th Select Committee. Because once you've attempted a coup, obstructing Congress is pretty small beer. With the committee planning to hold public hearings in the coming months, look for the GOP antics to kick up to 11. Trump has already scheduled a press conference for January 6th. God only knows what horror he plans to visit on us that day. All of which is blanking depressing for New Year's Eve. It's kind of a piece with a blanking depressing year. But you're still here, and we're still here. And our kids are still here, and they are very good. And we keep marching, and we keep fighting because we beat these blanks before, and we will beat them again. What other choice do we have? And that's the article 2021, We Had a Coup by Liz Dye on Wonkette.com. And the second article, January 6th opinion polls show Republicans still pretending to believe a lot of blank. It's by Robin Pinaccia from January 3rd, 2022, from Wonkette.com. This Thursday will mark the one-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, in which hundreds of Trumpists attacked Congress in hopes that doing so would lead to them just giving up and letting Donald Trump be president for another 4 years. Election be damned. Now a spate of polls has come out, all telling us pretty much the same damn thing. A majority of Americans think what happened that day was not great. And that's nice. The problem is the minority of Americans who believe it was great, and that those participating in the attack were, quote, protecting democracy, end quote. And that minority is still too big for comfort. The ABC Ipsos poll found, quote, an overwhelming majority, 72% of Americans, believe the people involved in the attack on the Capitol were, quote, threatening democracy, unquote. While 1 in 4 Americans believes that the individuals involved were, quote, protecting democracy. Broken down by party identification, Democrats are nearly unanimous, 96% in believing that those involved in the attacks were threatening democracy. Republicans are more split, with 45% saying it was a threat, and 52% saying those involved in the riot were, quote, protecting democracy. End quote of the article. That's a quarter of the population. That's a lot of people. Millions of people. That's not great. The Washington Post UMD poll found, quote, the percentage of Americans who say violent action against the government is justified at times stands at 34%, which is considerably higher than in past polls by the Post or other major news organizations dating back more than 2 decades. Again, the view is partisan. The new survey finds 40% of Republicans, 41% of independents, and 23% of Democrats saying violence is sometimes justified. And that's the end quote from the Washington Post. This should come as no surprise to absolutely no one. What do we think happens when a group of people are repeatedly told and assured that they have the right, and the obligation to overthrow the government with their guns when things don't go their way. The NRA spent actual decades pushing this interpretation of the Second Amendment, and it worked out fabulously for them in terms of dismantling and preventing gun control. It's also worked considerably well for right-wing personalities and politicians because it's part of a story their base loves to hear about themselves. They like to think of themselves as patriots, as the real Americans, as following in the footsteps of the Founding Fathers. The idea that it is their job to protect the country from, quote, tyranny, unquote, makes them feel good about themselves. The CBS News poll found, quote, outright approval of what happened comes only from a minority of Americans, but it certainly is there. Those who approve are younger and use right-leaning news sources and social media more, but they also have what seems like larger items than just their views about 2020 or an election. They are more likely to say the United States should divide into red and blue countries. There's a relationship between approval and conspiracy theories. Among Americans who think QAnon ideas are at least probably true, approval of the Capitol events goes up to 50%. That's the end quote from the CBS News. The surprising thing here is that it's not 100%. Or one slightly more unusual finding from that particular poll was the large chunk of people who believed that, quote, most of the people who invaded the Capitol were left-leaning groups. And then it's got a graphic here where it's a CBS News poll. Most who forced their way into the Capitol on January 6th were, and you have from Republicans, 6% think that typical of most Trump supporters, 50% say Trump supporters but not typical, and 41% say it was left-leaning groups who forced their way into the Capitol on January 6th. Okay. It was one thing, I suppose, for people to believe that on January 7th, or even in the weeks after, it was certainly a popular narrative, one that made it easy for some conservatives to distance themselves from the riots without explicitly condemning them, while playing right into the hands of people who like to appear, quote, reasonable, unquote, by claiming, quote, both sides. But we literally know who these people are now. Over 700 of them have been arrested, and if even one of them were a leftist other than that activist John guy, we never would have heard the end of it. Every one of the people we know who was arrested was a Trump supporter. What do people suspect? That these people simply pretended to be Trump supporters for the last several years, potentially alienating themselves from friends and family and getting iced off dating apps, just so that on January 6th of 2021 they could invade the Capitol and make Trump supporters look bad? What do they think is going on here? Alas, it's probably less likely that they actually seriously believe it when it is that they would really like for other people to believe it. And they think if they keep pretending to believe it and repeat it over and over again, it will catch on. Same deal, really, with a lot of people claiming they really truly think Trump won the election, which, according to the ABC poll, is 71% of all Republicans. Creating that doubt is the smart public relations move. Quite frankly, the right has adopted trolling and insincerity as an ethos, which really makes it hard to discern what they sincerely believe and what they are pretending to believe, because they think doing so will totally, quote, own the libs. Unfortunately, it's not clear if that matters or not. That article can be found under the headline, January 6 Opinion Polls Show Republicans Still Pretending to Believe a Lot of. It's a four-letter word, begins with S. I refer to it as blank. Although on a syndicated show Sunday night, they let that word slip out over the airwaves from a supposed caller. Really scripted shills. I have to believe that they have a drop button, so that was deliberate. And then another caller, scripted shill, pretending to be a caller, was going on about it all being the fault of a certain religious group, and not Muslims. It begins with a J. Anyway, they let that go over the airwaves, and since I assume they must have a drop button and know how to use it, that must have been deliberate too. I don't know, maybe they're trying to convince people that they actually take real calls, and so they have some that are clinkers. Or else they really want something to go out where they're pushing the envelope of what words they can say on the air and what recycled Nazi propaganda they can float. Anyway, this is the Servative Hour, broadcast live on KZUM, and this is KZUM Lincoln and KZUM HD 89.3 FM, KZUM.org online in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the topic is the January 6th, 2021 anniversary. Weather, 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 weather. Springtime, summertime, fall time, winter time. It's always time for the weather. Lincoln, Nebraska weather conditions. It's now 18 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. Winds, not much wind, just 3 to 5 miles per hour coming out of the northwest. And it's predicted to be much colder. It's going to be a low of 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And tomorrow, a high of 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, now I'm going to get to an article from The New Yorker, which was published January 25th, 2021, which gives a fairly good accounting of January 6th, 2021, and events surrounding that date. It's titled The Storm, and it's by a reporter at large, Luke Mogelson. The storm, in the weeks before the assault on the Capitol, the president and his supporters kept stoking paranoia and rage. By the end of President Donald Trump's crusade against American democracy, after a relentless deployment of propaganda, demagoguery, intimidation, and fear-mongering aimed at persuading as many Americans as possible to repudiate their country's foundational principles, a single word sufficed to nudge his most fanatical supporters into open insurrection. Thousands of them had assembled on the Mall in Washington, D.C. on the morning of January 6th to hear Trump address them from a stage outside the White House. From where I stood at the foot of the Washington Monument, you had to strain to see his image on a jumbotron that had been set up on Constitution Avenue. His voice, however, projected clearly through powerful speakers as he rehashed the debunked allegations of massive fraud which had been propagating for months. Then he summarized the supposed crimes simply as, quote, well, it's a double word here, 8 letters long, begins with a B, and in the middle it has an S. And anyway, he said, blank. I'll just have to say blank. Blank, blank, the crowd chanted. Yes, it was a peculiar mixture of emotion that had become familiar at pro-Trump rallies since he lost the election. Half mutinous rage, half gleeful excitement at being licensed to act on it. The profanity signaled a final jettisoning of whatever residual deference to political norms had survived the past 4 years. In front of me, a middle-aged man wearing a Trump flag as a cape told a young man standing beside him, quote, "There's going to be a war." His tone was resigned as if he were, let me read that again, resigned, quote, "There's going to be a war." His tone was resigned as if he were at last embracing a truth that he had long resisted, quote, "I'm ready to fight," he said. The young man nodded. He had a thin mustache and hugged a life-size mannequin with duct tape over its eyes. Quote, "Traitor," scrawled on its chest and a noose around its neck. Quote, "We want to be so nice," Trump said. Oh, let me try that again. Quote, "We want to be so nice," Trump said. Quote, "We want to be so respectful of everybody, including bad people. We're going to have to fight much harder, and Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us." End quote. About a mile and a half away at the east end of the mall, Vice President Pence and both houses of Congress had convened to certify the Electoral College votes that had made Joe Biden and Kamala Harris the next president and vice president of the United States. In December, 140 Republican representatives, two-thirds of the caucus, had said that they would formally object to the certification of several swing states. 14 Republican senators, led by Josh Hawley of Missouri and Ted Cruz of Texas, had joined the effort. The lawmakers lacked the authority to overturn the election, but Trump and his allies had concocted a fantastical alternative. Pence, as the presiding officer of the Senate, could single-handedly nullify votes from states that Biden had won. Pence, though, had advised Congress that the Constitution constrained him from taking such action. Quote, "After this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you," Trump told the crowd. The people around me exchanged looks of astonishment and delight. Quote, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. We're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength." Quote, "No weakness," a woman cried. Before Trump had even finished his speech, approximately 8,000 people started moving up the mall. Quote, "We're storming the Capitol," some yelled. There was an eerie sense of inexorability, the throngs of Trump supporters advancing up the long lawn as if pulled by a current. Everyone seemed to understand what was about to happen. The past 9 weeks had been steadily building towards this moment. On November 7th, mere hours after Biden's win was projected, I attended a protest at the Pennsylvania State Capitol in Harrisburg. Hundreds of Trump supporters, including heavily armed militia members, vowed to revolt. When I asked a man with an assault rifle, a combat skills instructor for a militia called the Pennsylvania 3%, how likely he considered the prospect of civil conflict, he told me, quote, "It's coming." Since then, Trump and his allies had done everything they could to spread and intensify this bitter aggrievement. On December 5th, Trump acknowledged, quote, "I've probably worked harder in the last 3 weeks than I ever have in my life." He was not talking about managing the pandemic, which, since the election, has claimed 150,000 American lives. Militant pro-Trump outfits like the Proud Boys, a national organization dedicated to, quote, "reinstating a spirit of a Western chauvinism in America," end quote, had been openly gearing up for major violence. In early January, on Parler, an unfiltered social media site favored by conservatives, Joe Biggs, a top Proud Boys leader, had written, quote, "Every lawmakers who breaks their own stupid blanking laws should be dragged out of office and hung." End quote. And Happy New Year, and thank you to everyone who made a contribution to KZUM during our end-of-year giving campaign. Our listeners donated over $12,000. This is an amazing show of support, and we are so grateful to you for that. KZUM volunteers produced over 7,000 hours of on-air programs and podcasts in 2021. You are a huge part of that. Your donations keep our lights on and our signal strong, so we can keep you informed and grooving. Thank you. And the Servative Hour is followed by the Groove Machine, speaking of grooving, which is a program of modern Christian rock music that's on from midnight until 2 a.m. Wednesday morning. That is the Groove Machine. Now, back to the article. Let's see. Yes, Proud Boys leader had written, quote, every lawmakers? Well, anyway. Every lawmakers who breaks their own stupid blanking laws should be dragged out of office and hung, end quote. On the Mall, a makeshift wooden gallows with stairs and a rope had been constructed near a statue of Ulysses S. Grant. Some of the marchers nearby carried Confederate flags. Up ahead, the dull thud of stun grenades could be heard, accompanied by bright flashes. Quote, they need help, a man shouted. Quote, it's us versus the cops, end quote. Someone let out a rebel yell. I don't know if that was Billy Idol. Anyway, someone let out a rebel yell. Scattered groups wavered, debating whether to join the confrontation. Quote, we lost the Senate. We need to make a stand now. A bookish-looking woman in a down coat and glasses appealed to the person next to her. The previous day, a runoff in Georgia had flipped 2 Republican Senate seats to the Democrats, giving them majority control. Hundreds of Trump supporters had forced their way past barricades to the Capitol steps in anticipation of Biden's inauguration. Bleachers had been erected there, and the sides of the scaffolding were wrapped in ripstop tarpaulin. Officers in riot gear blocked an open flap in the fabric. The mob pressed against them, screaming insults. Quote, you are traitors to the country. A man barked at the police through a megaphone plastered with stickers from InfoWars, the incendiary web program hosted by the right-wing conspiracist Alex Jones. Behind the man stood Biggs, the Proud Boys leader. He wore a radio clipped onto his breast pocket of his plaid flannel shirt. Not far away, I spotted a, quote, straight pride, unquote, flag. There wasn't nearly enough law enforcement to fend off the mob, which pelted the officers with cans and bottles. One man angrily invoked the pandemic lockdown. Quote, why can't I work? Where's my pursuit of happiness? End quote. Many people were equipped with flak jackets, helmets, gas masks, and tactical apparel. Guns were prohibited for the protest, but a man in a cowboy hat posing for a photograph lifted his jacket to reveal a revolver tucked into his waistband. Other Trump supporters had tasers, baseball bats, and truncheons. I saw one man holding a coiled noose. Quote, hang Mike Pence, people yelled. Soon the mob swarmed past the officers into the understructure of the bleachers and scrambled through its metal braces up the building's granite steps. Toward the top was a temporary security wall with 3 doors, one of which was instantly breached. Dozens of police stood behind the wall, using shields, nightsticks, and pepper spray to stop people from crossing the threshold. Other officers took up positions on planks above, firing a steady barrage of non-lethal munitions into the solid mass of bodies. As rounds tinked off metal and caustic chemicals filled the space as if it were a fumigation tent, some of the insurrectionists panicked. Quote, we need to retreat and assault another point, end quote. But most remained resolute. Quote, hold the line, they exhorted. Quote, storm, unquote. Martial bagpipes blared through portable loudspeakers. Quote, shoot the politicians, somebody yelled. Quote, fight for Trump, end quote. A jet of pepper spray incapacitated me for about 20 minutes. When I regained my vision, the mob was streaming freely through all 3 doors. I followed an overweight man in a Roman-era costume, sandals, cape, arm guards, dagger, away from the bleachers and onto an open terrace on the Capitol's main level. People clambered through a shattered window. Video later showed that a Proud Boy had smashed it with a riot shield. A dozen police stood in a hallway softly lit by ornate chandeliers, mutely watching the rioters, many of them wearing Trump gear or carrying Trump flags. Fled into the building. Their cries resonated through colonnaded rooms. Quote, where's the traitors? quote, bring them out, quote, get these blanking commies out, end quote. The attack on the Capitol was a predictable apotheosis of a months-long ferment. Throughout the pandemic, right-wing protesters had been gathering at state houses, demanding entry. In April, an armed mob had filled the Michigan state capitol chanting, quote, treason, and, quote, let us in. In December, conservatives had broken the glass doors of the Oregon state capitol, overrunning officers and spraying them with chemical agents. The occupation of restricted government sanctums was an affirmation of dominance so emotionally satisfying that it was an end in itself, proof to elected officials, to Biden voters, and also to the occupiers themselves that they were still in charge. After one of the Trump supporters breached the U.S. Capitol, he insisted through a megaphone, quote, we will not be denied, end quote. There was an unmistakable subtext as the mob, almost entirely white, shouted, quote, whose house? Our house. One man carried a Confederate flag through the building. A black member of the Capitol Police later told BuzzFeed News that during the assault, he was called a racial slur 15 times. I'll take a break. Be back in a moment with more of the article titled The Storm, and with the topic being the January 6th, 2021 anniversary. Okay, the article continues. I followed a group that broke off to advance on 5 policemen guarding a side corridor. Quote, stand down, a man in a MAGA hat commanded. Quote, you're outnumbered. There's a blanking million of us out there, and we are listening to Trump, your boss. Quote, we can take you out, a man beside him warned. The officers backpedaled the length of the corridor until we arrived at a marble staircase. Then they moved aside. Quote, we love you guys. Take it easy, a rioter yelled as he bounded up the steps, which led to the Capitol's central rotunda. Beneath the soaring dome, surrounded by statues of former presidents and by large oil paintings depicting such historical scenes as the embarkation of the Pilgrims and the presence of the Declaration and the presentation of the Declaration of Independence, a number of young men chanted, quote, America first. The phrase was popularized in 1940 by Nazi sympathizers lobbying to keep the U.S. out of the Second World War. In 2016, Trump resurrected it to describe his isolationist foreign and immigration policies. Some of the chanters, however, waved or wore royal blue flags inscribed with, quote, AF in white letters. This is the logo for the program America First, which is hosted by Nicholas Fuentes, a 22-year-old Holocaust denier who promotes a brand of white Christian nationalism that views politics as a means of preserving demographic supremacy through American firsters revile such mainstream Republicans for lacking sufficient commitment to this priority, especially neoconservatives, who they accuse of being subservient to Satan and Jews. The group's loyalty to Trump is, according to Fuentes, quote, unconditional, unquote. The American firsters and other invaders fanned out in search of lawmakers breaking into offices and reveling in their own astounding impunity. Quote, Nancy, I'm home, a man taunted, mimicking Jack Nicholson's character in The Shining. Someone else yelled, quote, 1776, it's now or never. Around this time, Trump tweeted, quote, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country. USA demands the truth. 20 minutes later, Ashley Babbitt, a 35-year-old woman from California, was fatally shot while climbing through a barricaded door that led to the Speaker's lobby in the House chamber, where representatives were sheltering. The Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Democrat from New York, later said that she had a, quote, close encounter with rioters during which she thought she, quote, was going to die. Earlier that morning, another representative, Lauren Boebert, a newly elected Republican from Colorado, who has praised QAnon and promised to wear her Glock in the Capitol, had tweeted, quote, "Today is 1776, unquote. When Babbitt was shot, I was on the opposite side of the Capitol where people were growing frustrated by the empty halls and offices. Quote, where the blank are they? Quote, where the blank is Nancy? No one seemed quite sure how to proceed. Quote, while we're here, we might as well set up a government, somebody suggested. Then a man with a large AF flag, that's America First flag, college age, cheeks spotted with acne, pushed through a series of tall double doors, the last of which gave into the Senate chamber. Quote, praise God. There were signs of a hasty evacuation, bags and purses on the plush blue and red carpet, personal belongings on some of the desks. From the gallery, a man in a flak jacket called down, quote, take everything, take all that blank. Quote, no, an older man who wore an ammo vest and held several plastic flex cuffs shouted, quote, we do not take anything. The man has since been identified as Larry Randall Brock Jr., a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel. The young American firster went directly to the dais and installed himself in the leather chair recently occupied by the vice president. Another America firster filmed him extemporizing a speech. Quote, Donald Trump is the Emperor of the United States. Quote, hey, get out of that chair, a man about his age with a thick southern drawl said. I'll try that again. Quote, hi, get out of that chair, a man about his age with a thick southern drawl said. He wore cowhide work gloves and a camouflage hunting jacket that was several sizes too large for him. Gauze hung loosely around his neck, and blood leaking from a nasty wound on his cheek encrusted his beard. Later, when another rioter asked for his name, he responded, quote, Mr. Black. The American firster turned and looked at him uncertainly. Quote, we're a democracy, Mr. Black said. Quote, bro, we just broke into the Capitol. The American firster scoffed, quote, what are you talking about? Brock, the Air Force veteran, said, quote, we can't be disrespectful. Using the military acronym for information operations, he explained, you have to, quote, you have to understand it's an I.O. war. That's an information operations war. The America firster grudgingly left the chair. More than a dozen Trump supporters filled the chamber. 100 antique mahogany desks with engraved nameplates were arranged in 4-tiered semicircles. Several people swung open the hinged desktops and began riffing through documents inside, taking pictures with their phones of private notes and letters, partly completed crossword puzzles, manuals on Senate procedure. A man in a construction hard hat held up a hand-signed document on official stationery addressed from Mitt to Mike, presumably Romney and Pence. It was the speech that Romney had given in February 2020 when he voted to impeach Trump for pressuring the president of Ukraine to produce dirt on Biden. Quote, corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and disruptive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine, Romney had written. And I'm going to leave off on this article. There's plenty of great stuff in it, but it is a fairly long article. I wanted to finish up perhaps with another article that I have here. However, if you wanted to read more of that, it can be found under the title The Storm, and that's from The Storm Inside the Insurrection at the Capitol, and that's by Luke Mogelson from the New Yorker magazine, NewYorker.com, I assume. Kevin McCarthy furious, Democrats doing so little to protect Capitol from Republican Trump insurgents. It's by Evan Hurst, January 3rd, 2022, on Wonkette.com. Thursday is the one-year anniversary of that time a bunch of Republican terrorists attacked the U.S. Capitol to make the Republican president happy and to try to force Republicans in Congress to steal democracy for said president. So, of course, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who leads the fascist Republican political party in the House of Representatives, is very mad at Democrats for making everything so divisive and partisan right now. He explained this in a Welcome to 2022 letter to his Republican caucus, many members of which are open fascist seditionist insurgents. Quote, "As we have said from the start, the actions of that day were lawless and as wrong can be. Our capital should never be compromised, and those who broke the law deserve to face legal repercussions and full accountability. Unfortunately, 1 year later, the majority party seems no closer to answering the central question of how the Capitol was left so unprepared and what must be done to ensure it never happens again." End quote. Wait, was that the central question? Why the Capitol was so unprepared and vulnerable? Was the Capitol walking by itself very late at night? Was it wearing a short skirt? And why, pray tell, is the Capitol hitting itself? Tell us more, Kevin McCarthy, about how the, quote, central question of what happened that day was how the Capitol was so unprepared to be attacked by hordes of Donald Trump's terrorists. We are, of course, not saying that any security failures shouldn't be investigated and fixed, but they are not the central question, Kevin. As far as making sure it never happens again, the answers are simple. To begin with, imprison Trump and imprison every other person who helped him incite the terrorist attack in order to steal the election. The House January 6th Select Committee will help identify who that is. If the Justice Department is having a hard time coming up with a list of names, then pass reforms to make voting fairer and more accessible for all who are eligible, and eliminate things like partisan gerrymandering to start getting rid of the advantages Republicans have built in for themselves in a country that blanking hates them. Of course, there are many more things that would have to be done to wrest this country from the fascist halitosis jaws of the modern Republican Party, but those things would be a start. Kevin McCarthy was not finished whining. Quote from Kevin McCarthy, "Instead, they are using it as a partisan political weapon to further divide our country." End quote. The Democrats, he means. The Democrats are using the fascist Republican terrorist attack on the Capitol in order to steal an election for a loser fascist Republican president as a, quote, partisan political weapon. Back to what Kevin McCarthy had to say, quote, "By way of an update, House Administration Ranking Member Rodney Davis will be sending a memo to each of your offices outlining meaningful and measurable steps that should be taken to protect our capital from all threats, steps that the current majority party is negligent in acting upon." End quote. In case any more fascist Republican presidents incite the human blanks who love them to attack the Capitol again, some more. Quote, "This year will define what our country will be for the next decade. Will we be a country defined by freedom, opportunity, and prosperity, or will we continue to let Americans fall victim to division, malaise, and pessimism? I know the path you and I want to take. It's the path we all want to take, and I am confident the American people will join with us." Yeah, there's more to the letter, but you don't care. Here's the response from Adam Kinzinger, one of two Republican members of the January 6th committee. From Adam Kinzinger, quote, "The Capitol wasn't prepared for January 6th and should have been. But blaming the security posture for the violence is like blaming a home invasion on the owner for not having a proper security system." And just a few fact checks here from an article titled, it can come up, Fact Check Roundup, Debunking False Narratives About the January 6th Capitol Riot by Mackenzie Sadaghi from USA Today from January 4th, 2022. I'll just skip down a bit to what it says about protecting the Capitol. Pelosi's role in the attack. Social media users have attempted to shift blame by spreading false claims about Pelosi in the wake of the Capitol attack. The claim, Pelosi rejected Trump's request for 10,000 National Guard troops to be deployed before January 6th. They rate that as false. The truth is, Trump's claim that Pelosi blocked his formal request for 10,000 National Guard troops ahead of the Stop the Steal rally is false. The Pentagon said there is no record of the request, and Pelosi's office said she was not contacted about deploying the National Guard. Testimony and a Department of Defense memo about January 6th also confirm that. The claim that Nancy Pelosi was in charge of the Capitol Police on January 6th. They rate that as false. Pelosi was not in charge of the Capitol Police at the time of the riot. The agency is overseen by the Capitol Police Board, which is made up of the House and Senate Sergeants at Arms and the Capitol Architect. And the claim that Nancy Pelosi refuses to take responsibility for causing the insurrection at the Capitol building, they rate that as false. In short, Pelosi wasn't responsible. Capitol Police told USA Today that committees from the House and Senate and a Capitol Police Board are responsible for overseeing operations, not Pelosi. And the final claim here, Pelosi won't let the Capitol Police testify about what happened on January 6th. They rate that as false because the claim that Pelosi is blocking testimony is a reversal of what actually happened. Republican lawmakers tried to stop a hearing from taking place while Democrats pushed for one. And that's all we have time for. This has been the Servative Hour. Thank you very much for listening, and good night to you all.